All right. First thing I'll say is that we are extremely grateful to the John Templeton Foundation and Shirley Rhino Ability Lab in North Central University for funding our program. I mean, honestly, we want everybody to know that it's really a gift to allow us to expand on our research, and all your goals are our goals. And we want people to kind of, from both the sciences and the humanities, to see this as a area of research for everybody that has broad clinical social implications. This is something that's really important, that we really need the sciences and the humanities. And I can say, as a neuropsychologist, I am absolutely thankful that I ran into a scholar like Dan Cohen, who brings expertise as a religious studies faculty member and a cultural anthropologist. And I think that his work has significantly improved the nature of our research. And I hope that people that hear this interview will know about the importance of making sure that scientists seek out and get the expertise of humanities scholars. So very briefly, here's the title of our project, which is a little bit academic, but then we'll give a brief explanation. Our study is a longitudinal neuroimaging study of theistic relational processing in individuals with neurologic dysfunction. And in simple terms, our goal is to identify some specific neurologic correlates and some specific neuropsychological abilities that serve as the foundation of both transcendent experiences, which is connection with God or the divine, as well as connection with other individuals. And our research to date has shown that in general, a certain part of the right hemisphere where information is integrated, everything that we sense, our vision, our sensations, our what we hear, those sensations and every thought, emotion, behavior that you recreate are integrated in that part of the brain. And they give a sense of relationship of whatever is perceived to the self. And that allows us to be empathetic, where basically if we can relate to the thoughts and emotions of others and integrate them into our own experience, that's one way this process works. And the other, which is probably most relevant to your project, is when that part of the brain is turned off, that integration is turned off, that allows for experiences of selflessness, which is basically the way that the mystics and religious leaders throughout time have expressed their transcendent experiences. So that's the science piece. Dr. Cohen has the humanities piece and can kind of apply this to other faith traditions and religions. Dan, you want to maybe comment a bit?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brick. So one of the incredibly interesting parts of this is that in terms of brain function, similar things seem to be going on in the experience of transcendence, spiritual transcendence. And of course, the interpretation of those experiences is widely variant. So what's interesting to me, what fascinates me, is how the neuroscience fits so well with the religious experiences. And if we go across different cultures through time, through history, and in different cultural milieus, what we find is that people who have these powerful spiritually transcendent experiences express them in extremely similar ways. They have expressions that reflect their loss of their sense of self, their loss of their immediate sense of who they are, but they are still aware, they're still conscious. It's a different kind of awareness. So that is just incredibly amazing. So, for example, a Buddhist who has a spiritually transcendent experience is not going to tell you that they had connection with God, because in terms of Buddhist ideology, that doesn't make any sense. Buddhism believes that there is no eternal essence or self in that regard. That's a misunderstanding. Whereas, for example, a Carmelite nun who has that experience through centering prayer, a Christian meditative practice that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages or perhaps even longer, will tell you that she had union with God. She became one with God during that transcendent experience. So neurologically or neurobiologically, something similar is going on. We see a similar response in the neurophysiology of both these individuals, but the interpretation of their experience is absolutely variant, absolutely different, and fits with the background they have, their religious understandings, etc. To me, that's absolutely fascinating.
Jordan, do you want to?
I was, the description you just gave, Dan, sometimes is given. This might sound a little off, but sometimes it's given to explain how jazz pianists or saxophonists can improvise. That there has to be sort of a disconnection from their procedures and routines and prior experience in order to sort of, in some sense, go with the flow. And I don't know if that is a sense of transcendence as well.
So to answer that, transcendence appears to work along a spectrum. You can have small little instances of transcendence. We all have them every day where we get lost in what we're doing, heavily engrossed. We look up at the clock and, oh my God, 2 hours went by. How did that happen? That's normal. What is very interesting is that in terms of mystical experience, now we're at the far end of that spectrum when there's really a ramping down, a really eradication of the immediate sense of self. And then we find that opens up a very different type of experience. And in fact, it's not even restricted to religions and religious traditions. I find evidence of this in atheism as well, where major vocal proponents of atheism, when you look at what they talk about in terms of having a powerful experience, they have transcendent experiences too, but and yet the interpretive framework obviously is now no longer within a religious paradigm, but is now in terms of atheist understanding of the world, whether it be secular humanism or whatever it might be.
So are you saying then that transcendence, while it appears among different religious groups, is not unique and therefore maybe has, in some sense, less to do with religion itself than with another kind of experience or with another kind of sort of belief system?
Well, it looks like, our research seems to be showing that we are wired. We are neurologically wired to have selfless experiences, to lose our sense of self. And at the extreme level, at the far ends of this experience, then it becomes or can become a mystical type of experience if one indeed interprets it that way. So there seems to be a machinery built in to human architecture, neuroarchitecture, and that's just absolutely fascinating. And yet, that machinery, the results of that, in terms of what people experience, is quite different. Now, there is a lot of conversation in religious studies about the nature of religious experience. And one of those models is that, well, there's no such thing as a genuine religious experience. I don't actually subscribe to that model. I think we are neurologically wired to have the potentiality for these experiences, and we have been having them. There's a reason that we find religion in virtually every culture in the world. There must be something about this that is important.
So besides being important, would you say that, in fact, it's reinforcing that if you've had a transcendent experience, you want to have it again?
They seem to be sought out, yes. And religions have created a whole sets of rituals to help people have these types of experiences. And that is absolutely fascinating. So when we look at the rituals are different from each other. They're obviously circumscribed quite differently in terms of religious understandings and ideologies. And yet there seems to be a bioneurological backdrop that is similar to when these experiences occur.
So given that, I'm wondering, you're going to study Parkinson's patients, is that correct or not? What kind of patients are you going to study?
No.
Remind me.
Brain injury, stroke, and multiple sclerosis.
Okay. And do you expect any of those patients to have, for example, dopaminergic or serotonergic deficits in some way? on the basis of their lesion? And if that's the case, would it make these kinds of experiences less reinforcing? What's your thought about that, Brick?
Well, it's interesting. If I can make a quick comment about your integration question before, or your flow states. So the way that I think that we can conceptualize this quite simply is there's different experiences of selflessness, a decreased sense of self, and as neuropsychologists, the three of us will focus on disorders of the self, where it's kind of like you do not recognize your arm as a part of yourself, or you do not recognize the thought. That is one type of selflessness. Another would be flow states. And you probably described it better. And it's kind of like people, they listen to music and it's like they become one with the music. So it's not like I'm a self, but I've been integrated into the music. And what we would say is that transcendent spiritual experiences are the same, where basically you become integrated into something much larger than ourselves. So it's almost like empathy and is like the experience of loving, where transcendence and flow states are the experience of being loved. So it's like being integrated into something larger than yourself, and then culture dictates that.
Well, given that, and given the kinds of patients you're going to study, what do you anticipate that you might find? What do you hope to find, in some sense, by studying patients with lesions potentially in different areas of the brain, and how it affects their relational aspects of their relational beliefs with God? What do you think?
Yeah, so we're not going to comment on like any dopamine, any chemicals. Mm-hmm. So what we like about our study is that this, as far as I know, is the first longitudinal study of people who we expect to change neurologically over time. And theoretically, if there's a certain part of the brain that is tied to the sense of self, over time, if it changes with neurologic injury, then theoretically transcendent should also change, and character traits. So we have two different types of samples. We have people with brain injury that theoretically should improve over time. And then we have people with MS that theoretically should decline over time. So we're going to give them measures of transcendence and character traits, and we should expect to see an opposite direction of how the relationship change for those two different samples. We're also going to primarily look at people with left hemisphere versus right hemisphere injuries. And I'm excited to say we've just recruited our first participant. He's got a head injury and a gunshot wound to the right parietal lobe.
Oh my God. And survived the gunshot wound.
Survived it. So you know what? It's going to be really interesting to have people with a real diversity of neurologic impairments. But I wasn't expecting to find people with those focal impairments that might allow us to do more case studies.
Why don't you tell our visitors to the website what kind of baseline data you're going to get on these people in terms of their prior religious commitments?
Yes. So we worked hand in hand with you and the other people that have been funded to make sure that we are all being as consistent as possible. For our excuse me, for our neurologic functioning, we are getting fMRIs, which real basically looks at the function of the brain, what parts of the brain are functioning better or worse than the others. We're also getting measures of neuropsychological functioning, like what's the integrity of the right part of the brain versus the left part of the brain versus the front and the back. And then we're getting some subjective measures of transcendence. There's some measures that have been developed, brief multidimensional measure of religiousness and spirituality. We're also getting measures of empathy and altruism from the Penner Prosocial Personality Inventory. And then something new that we're doing today, we're giving something called the Cambridge Depersonalization Scale. And this is a measure that's traditionally been given for people with psychiatric disorders of the self, where people will say, I don't feel like my body is part of me, or I don't feel connected to my thoughts. some of the things that you were talking about before, Dr. Grafman. So we want to kind of look at these disorders of self, these transcendent experiences, these functional neuroimaging measures, and these neuropsychological measures.
So let me ask both of you, and then I'll let Patrick talk. I've been babbling, but my question here would be, when you ask people questions about transcendence, do you think that they alone are only able to answer those questions, so that, say, a spouse, for example, who's lived with this person, couldn't really comment on the transcendent experience of the individual you're questioning? What do you think?
You want to take that, Dan?
Yeah. So, Dr. Grafman, I think what's going on here is that it is a very individual experience in that regard. However, people around that experience who see someone in that experience, they're trying to understand it as well. So then we get into really shared religious cosmologies and things like that. Seriously. So in terms of our study, one of the things that is important to me is that we get some background information on the religious affiliation of the people involved in our study and significant members of the family as well, and ask about religious upbringing, because this will help us understand that interpretive process. To sort of broaden that out for a second, I mean, one of the amazing things about this type of research is that one can have a selfless experience and feel that they're connected to some kind of totality, to nature, to the cosmos. And on the other hand, one can have an experience where the self is just completely eradicated. So those understandings almost seem diametrically opposed. And earlier on in some of the neuroscience literature, it was argued that those were two different types of brain operations, but they are not. They are one and the same. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Real quick, Jordan, we are doing what you suggested. So we are talking to family members, and we're doing semi-structured interviews with both our participants and our family members. And we're not sure that we're going to be able to really ask the family members about, tell us about the transcendent experience of your loved one. But we can say, have you noticed, do they seem to be more spiritual over this timeline? Or have they become less spiritual? Or do you see them as being more empathetic or forgiving? Or so we are going to look at that to see if that might be a good way for other investigators to follow.
That's great.
I think that's great too. I think you get really unique information if you query family members of people with brain disorders. So that's great. But I think what you gentlemen have been talking about is absolutely fundamental to religion, religious studies, religiosity, and fundamental to the brain. And that's this idea of selflessness, eradication of the self as a fountain or source of mystical experiences, spiritual experiences in general, even for quote unquote atheists. So I agree that you put your finger on the absolutely central question to me in the cognitive neuroscience religious experience, this issue of selflessness. And so I have a couple of questions about it. In my writings, in my previous work, I've called it decentering. And I think it's called something like that in mindfulness meditation as well, because there are ways to understand mindfulness meditation as working on the sense of self and shifting from, the everyday sense of self to an observer or compassionate self, who observes, accepts, and so forth. And then there's the emerging psychedelic literature that talks about you need the ego dissolution experience at high doses in order to get the clinical benefits from psychedelics. And when the neuroimaging has been done in psychedelics, I think most psychedelic scientists would say that the neuroimaging suggests that what is causal for the ego dissolution experience that leads to reports of mystical experiences is loss of intrinsic connectivity in the default mode network. Whereas what you guys have been finding in your past work, Rick, is that it's not so much the entire default mode network, it's the integration center in the parietal lobe. Is that right? Specifically on the right. Would you say
That's correct? That's correct, but really it's interesting. Andrew Dennison, who's a physician, a rehab physician working with us, he's more convinced that we need to look more at the default mode network. So we will do that in our research because it's, we've told you before, we have cited both of your works, Dr. McNamara and Dr. Grafman, and kind of helping us formulate ours. So we're kind of we're being pushed that way, thank goodness, but we are really kind of focused on the general right hemisphere association area.
But Rick, what I'm saying to you is that the psychedelic researchers are coming over to your point of view. They're saying,
yes, they're
saying
right.
we look too broadly at the default mode network, and we think the key node here is something like maybe the posterior cingulate cortex, parietal lobe on the right.
So to follow up on that idea, if it's the right, and let's be simple here, often people think that left is language, right is spatial. Does that accommodate your ideas in some sense that if it's mostly on the right, you're sort of suppressing linguistic interpretation during transcendence, and you're experiencing what's that, Patrick?
Yeah, I think you may be onto something there. And who's the master and emissary guy, the guy who wrote that book?
Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah, he argues something very much like that. So there's a lot of exciting converging stuff here. And I very briefly wanted to get back to what Dan was talking about, the spectrum idea. Like in our everyday, like if you're a religious person, every day, or everybody undergoes, insults to their self-esteem, or insults to the self. And so that's one level. But then to get to mystical states, you need something much more dramatic, like Dan, you were saying, self-eradication. And as you were saying, many religious traditions give us all kinds of ascetical practices and ritual practices to help us overcome the daily ego, the daily sense of self, so that we can get to that transcendent sense of self. So here's for the religious humanities part of things. The mindfulness meditation people in many traditions in the Buddhist and indeed in the Christian traditions as well say it's not so much eradicating the self. Yeah, it's eradicating a false self, but it's an enriching of a deeper sense of self that is a compassionate awareness kind of. There's still a sense of self there. It's a different sense of self. You see what I'm saying? It's not no self. There's some traditions that say no self, but even in those, when you read their reports, there's some kind of sense of an awareness self, you might say. I don't know what you think about that, Dan, but
well, let me comment on that. I mean, that's a wonderful comment. So what we find is that people who have powerful mystical experiences, we hear that they can't be described. They're ineffable, is a word often used in religious studies. And then, of course, we have massive numbers of texts describing those experiences.
Right, yeah.
But in terms of hemisphericity that you were asking about before, when you get that shutdown in the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere doesn't, has to interpret it a different way. So the interpretation doesn't come maybe during the experience, but after the experience, which is an attempt to share it with other people. But it's a very difficult thing to do. What we see is that there are all different ways of understanding how that experience occurs. So, for example, in Hinduism, one of the philosophical traditions of Hinduism, a non-dual tradition called Advaita Vedanta, the idea is that we don't truly understand the nature of that self But if we understood the nature of our eternal self, then we would understand its connection to the cosmic totality called Brahman, and we would make that association, and thereby we would achieve this deep enlightenment, this deep understanding, and ultimately salvation. And yes, it changes one's personality. It changes one. One tends to, and we see this in the psychological literature, that people who have had powerful mystical experiences, we also see it in the near-death experience literature.
Yes.
They change their whole orientation toward other people, toward their religious traditions, changes radically, and they become more humble, more compassionate, better psychologically adjusted, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think one of the amazing things is that for so long, psychology and psychiatry saw intense religious experiences as a form of psychopathology. It's not till we get to the, DSM-4 that we finally get a little bit of leverage there. And that.
So Dan, in some sense, as I just listened to you, and as I've listened to Brick, some of this explanation really focuses on the individual, right? It's the individual sort of seeking the experience or enjoying the experience and then reflecting on it afterwards. One of our approaches in the larger project has been how related our general social interactions and social beliefs. That is, how important is it then to find others, and is that limited by brain damage in any way, who have a similar transcendent experience? What do you think?
Well, I think it's conducive to what happens is it makes people able to relate to others better. It seems to religious experiences, engaging together in religious rituals enhances pro-social behaviors, enhances social bonding. So I think what happens is individuals come back from these experiences. Yes, it was very important for the individual, but then they reintegrate themselves into society, and society is quite fascinated by what's happened. And I think that creates a very positive social bonding. So we can now, and we've written about it a little bit, we can differentiate between religious pathology, sort of, schizophrenia and religious delusions, versus someone who has a full-blown spiritually transcendent experience and psychologically is in a much better place and is able to come back and share that with other people, do not see that experience as happening outside themselves, but within themselves, and then encouraging others to also perhaps engage in that experience. So it becomes a community of, I understand, I see the truth now with you.
So clearly certain religious groups have more transcendent experiences reported and share it within the group. So I have two questions then for you guys.
Jordan, sorry to interrupt, but because we're on my private Zoom, it's the meeting's going to automatically end in like 3 minutes or something. I apologize.
No,
to everybody.
I'll keep it short, really. First of all, what's the frequency of these experiences in the general population, right? If there's some data. And second, Brick, what do you expect to happen to people reporting these experiences, either with MS or after brain damage, like a stroke or a traumatic brain injury? So first, Dan, how often do you see this on the average person? What's your transcendence?
I don't have a statistic for you. I'm sorry. But again, like I said, it's a spectrum. So you have to look for the cases that are most extreme. And what I've done is looked at the history of religions and found numerous cases cutting across history and cultural boundaries.
Thank you. And Brick, what do you think is going to happen here?
Yeah, so I would almost state it's almost like a personality distinction between trait and state. And state, the mystical experience is you're on the mountain, you're overcome. And the trait is like, I just feel closer to God. I think we're going to see more of the trait changes in trait experiences of closeness. But give me a year and I'll let you know.
Okay, that's a deal.